Welcome to Silent Case, where lost stories resurface and secrets refuse to stay buried. Tonight, we dive into a mystery that has baffled generations. The story of a ship that vanished without a trace, only to return decades later. What happened aboard the SS Meridian? Who survived and who was lost forever? Stay with us as we uncover a tale of disappearance, time, and the ocean's darkest secrets. On a still summer night in 1933, the SS Meridian drifted across the Strait of Malacca beneath a moon so bright it cut a silver path across the water. The crew of 23 men had settled into the quiet rhythm of routine sailing. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. The ship, modest in size and dependable in reputation, was 3 days into what should have been an uneventful voyage. Its logs reflected nothing but calm weather, calm seas, and a calm crew. At 11:08 p.m., the Meridian sent its final radio transmission. Young radio officer Alan Brooke, only 19 and eager to prove himself, reported steady winds and clear visibility. His voice, according to archived transcripts, sounded relaxed. There was no tremor of fear, no hesitation, just a simple, steady update that would later haunt investigators for its normalcy. Captain Oscar Raines, a man known for precision and a temper kept firmly in check, approved the message before turning in for the night. The ship was stable. The men were rested. The ocean was still. Those who later studied the case often returned to the same detail: the weather logs. Every line of data, barometric pressure, wind speed, surface temperature, painted the same picture. It was a perfect night for sailing, the kind mariners cherished. Nothing in the skies or the currents suggested danger. Even decades later, meteorologists would insist that the conditions around the Meridian had been ideal beyond question. And yet, at some point between 11:08 p.m. and 11:20 p.m., everything changed. The gap, just 12 minutes, became the heart of the mystery. 12 minutes in which the ship offered no distress signal, no shift in course, no flicker of radio static beyond the ordinary. Search teams would later analyze the timeline again and again, hoping to find a hidden clue buried inside those final moments. But the record remained stubbornly silent. At 11:14 p.m., a nearby cargo vessel reported seeing a faint light on the horizon, possibly a mast lamp, but it vanished almost instantly. At 11:17 p.m., a fishing boat several miles southwest noted an unusual stillness, a sudden quiet that seemed to settle over the waves. No one connected these observations at the time. They were written off as coincidence, fragments of memory that carried no weight. But by 11:20 p.m., the SS Meridian had ceased to exist on the Naval Registry's live chart. No distress call, no flare, no sound, just absence. In the hours that followed, nothing appeared on the waves where the Meridian had been. No debris drifted to the surface. No oil slick spread across the water. The ship had not sunk, at least not in any way the sea chose to reveal. By sunrise, the first search vessels were en route. Families gathered at the docks, and investigators stared at the 12-minute gap that defied every rule of maritime logic. The Meridian had slipped into silence so quickly, so cleanly, it was as if the ocean had swallowed not just the ship, but the very traces of its passing. And the sea, for now, refused to give anything back. The disappearance of the SS Meridian sent a quiet tremor through the Maritime offices in Southampton, but at first, no one dared speak of catastrophe. Ships occasionally drifted off schedule. Weather reports were sometimes incomplete and radio silence, while unusual was not unheard of. Yet the timing of the Meridian's last transmission lingered uneasily in the minds of those who reviewed the logs. 12 minutes, barely enough time for a message, let alone a crisis, had swallowed the vessel whole. When the first search orders were issued, the operation was modest: 2 patrol cutters and a radio advisory to nearby ships. Officials expected a mechanical failure, perhaps a dead engine or a navigation miscalculation. But as dawn broke over the Atlantic, the calmness of the sea painted an entirely different picture. Fishermen reported glass-smooth waters, no storm debris, no oil slicks, not even a drifting crate that might hint at distress. The ocean looked undisturbed, almost indifferent to the ship it had taken. The search widened quickly. By the third day, reconnaissance aircraft scanned the Meridian's intended route. The sky was cloudless, and visibility stretched for miles. Pilots radioed back identical observations. Nothing. No shattered planks. No floating lifeboats. No discoloration of the water. The sea was insultingly empty. One commander noted in his report that it felt as if the ship had never existed at all. Behind closed doors, quiet urgency settled over the investigation. Captain Oscar Raines was not the type to panic or veer off course. His logs from previous voyages revealed a disciplined, steady mariner. Alan Brooke, barely 21 and meticulous in his transmissions, would never abandon protocol. Both men were as predictable as the lighthouse routines that guided their approach home. Yet something had severed their connection to the world without leaving the faintest scar behind. Families crowded the port offices, clinging to hope in newspaper clippings and vague reassurances. Some swore the Meridian must have been hijacked. Others whispered about rogue waves or sudden squalls that swallowed ships whole. But the weather reports contradicted every dramatic theory. The ocean that night was calm enough to reflect the moon in perfect clarity. It had offered no warning, no violence, only silence. As days blurred into weeks, the search grid expanded until it became absurdly large, stretching beyond areas a Meridian would logically ever reach. It was as though investigators were chasing a ghost. Every widening circle of ocean revealed the same infuriating truth. There was nothing to find. No signal from a lifeboat beacon. No drifting bodies. No washed-ashore fragments along distant coasts. The sea had given up nothing. In the final official report, one line stood out starkly against the bland technical jargon. The vessel and crew appeared to have been removed from observed space. It was an unusual phrase, almost poetic, and investigators later admitted it was a desperate attempt to avoid writing the word impossible. But the case was far from over. Even as the file was closed, an unease settled over those who had searched the empty sea. Something felt unfinished, suspended, waiting. And decades later, when the Meridian returned, that silence would come roaring back. For nearly 6 months after the SS Meridian vanished, hope lingered like a fading lantern in the homes of the 23 families waiting for news. Newspapers still printed occasional speculation, miracle sightings, unverified radio echoes, alleged debris recovered by distant trawlers, but each claim dissolved under scrutiny. Behind official walls, the investigation had run dry. Officers pored over the same charts until the ink wore thin, yet the sea yielded no truth, only an unbroken expanse of silence. At last, with no answers and no wreckage, the Maritime Board reached a decision everyone had dreaded. The file was stamped closed, and the Meridian was formally declared lost with all hands. But for those left behind, closure meant nothing. On a cold autumn morning, the families were summoned to a modest hall near the harbor. The officials spoke in careful, measured tones, acknowledging grief without offering comfort. They cited exhaustive searches, impeccable weather logs, and the absence of any evidence pointing to foul play. The room felt heavy, as though even the air knew it carried a burden too cruel for words. Mothers clutched handkerchiefs. Fathers sat rigid, jaws clenched. Some still believed their sons or husbands were alive somewhere, stranded on a deserted island or rescued by an uncharted ship. But most simply wanted something to bury, something to hold on to. The youngest widow, Clara Brooke, sat in the back. She had married Alan, the radio officer, only 4 months before he boarded the Meridian. Their wedding portrait still hung crookedly in her hallway, untouched since the day she received the first telegram. She listened as the official spoke, but their words slipped past her like water. In her lap, she held Alan's last letter, dated 3 days before the disappearance. He had written about calm skies, a smooth voyage, and how he planned to bring her a carved shell from Madeira. There had been no hint of fear, no shadow creeping between the lines. Just a man with his life ahead of him. Down the row sat the family of Captain Oscar Raines. His daughter, Margaret, tall and resolute, faced the officials with a quiet intensity. She refused to believe her father would allow a crisis to overcome him without leaving some trace. She had memorized his habits, his precision, his tendency to document everything. The idea that he and his entire crew could vanish without a single sign gnawed at her like an unresolved chord. The closing of the case felt premature, almost insulting. She vowed silently that she would not let the world forget the Meridian. Outside, the sea remained maddeningly calm, rolling in with its gentle sighs, offering no confession. Some families walked to the pier, staring into the twilight as though expecting the ship to crest the horizon any moment. Their eyes held a blend of longing and resignation, the kind that never fully fades. Years would pass and the Meridian would become a whispered memory, a cautionary tale for sailors, a ghost in maritime folklore. The official file gathered dust on a forgotten shelf. But the ocean does not forget. And 90 years later, when the SS Meridian returned without warning, every unanswered question would surge back to surface, darker, stranger, and far more urgent than before. 90 years after the SS Meridian vanished, the world had stopped asking questions. The ship lived only in dusty archives, in stories told by aging grandchildren who barely remember the names connected to its tragedy. But in the early hours of June 14th, 2022, that silence shattered. Just before dawn, Harbor Patrol Officer Evan Malik noticed an unregistered silhouette drifting toward Greywater Harbor. At first, he assumed it was an abandoned fishing trawler, the kind that sometimes broke anchor and wandered. But as it drew closer, its outline sharpened into something unmistakably older. A narrow bow, weathered wooden railings. A mast that looked like it belonged in a museum. His breath caught. The ship moved with eerie steadiness despite the absence of engine noise. No lights. No crew on deck. It slid through the fog as though it had been waiting decades for this moment. By the time Evan boarded his patrol boat and approached, the fog had thinned just enough to reveal the name etched across the hull. SS Meridian. The letters were chipped but legible, as though aged naturally. Yet the ship itself seemed preserved. Not new, not restored. Simply untouched by the years that should have destroyed it. Evan radioed in, voice trembling despite his training. Within minutes, emergency vessels surrounded the Meridian, their floodlights slicing through the mist. Officials expected wreckage, decay, something to justify the impossible tableau before them. Instead, they found a vessel intact, floating cleanly, its deck glistening with fresh moisture as if it had been at sea only days, not 9 decades. When the first boarding team climbed aboard, they were met with disquiet that words could barely contain. The ship was deserted, every corridor silent, yet signs of life lingered like echoes refusing to die. A metal mug still sat on a small table in the mess, half filled with darkened coffee. A playing card lay mid-game on a crate, untouched by weather. In the captain's quarters, a journal rested open, ink frozen mid-sentence, the last stroke sharp and unbroken. Even more chilling was the timestamp, June 1933. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no rot, no storm damage. Only absence, clean, absolute, deliberate. By noon, the harbor was sealed. Crowds gathered along the shoreline, murmuring, pointing, recording blurry images on their phones. Journalists arrived within hours, broadcasting headlines that felt ripped from folklore. A ghost ship returns after 90 years. But behind the cameras, investigators moved with a restrained urgency. They knew this was not folklore. This was a wound reopened. The families of the long-lost crew were notified first. Most declined interviews. Some wept quietly on their doorsteps. A few, like Margaret Raines, now 82, sat in stunned silence, hands trembling, realizing the past she assumed Barrett had just resurfaced without warning. By evening, the Meridian was secured inside a private dock, guarded heavily. Forensics teams prepared aboard once daylight returned. They expected answers, fingerprints, DNA, logs, something to anchor the impossibility. But as dusk fell, a patrol officer reported something unsettling. The ship's old radio, unpowered, disconnected, had crackled for a brief second. Just a hiss, a heartbeat of static, barely a whisper, enough to pull the investigation into territory no one was prepared for. The captain's quarters smelled faintly of varnish and salt, a strange combination considering the Meridian had been at sea for decades, or so it should have been. Forensic teams hesitated at the threshold, eyes drawn to the desk where a leather-bound journal lay open, its pages unervingly crisp. Ink, black and steady, formed letters so sharp they could have been written yesterday. Nothing in that room, or the rest of the ship, conformed to the passage of 90 years. The logbook belonged to Captain Oscar Raines, and as investigators flipped the pages, the unease deepened. Each entry was meticulous, describing the same calm seas, measured course corrections, and diligent crew routines that had been documented in 1933. Yet the final entry was different. It was shorter, jagged, almost trembling in its cadence. The fog thickens. Horizon bends unnaturally. Crew senses voices. Something approaches. 2340. I feel the ship slowing. Cannot account for drift. Awaiting observation. Investigators paused. The notation itself was impossible. The handwriting betrayed no panic. But the words hinted at something beyond explanation. Forensic analysts examined the paper. Aging tests, ultraviolet scans, even chemical composition analyses, all confirmed what no one could reconcile. The pages were consistent with paper produced decades later, yet the ink bore characteristics of mid-20th century formula. It was a contradiction, a frozen paradox, as though the ship had been ripped from time and preserved. Inside the journal, mundane details, engine checks, meal rotations, weather observations, coexisted with subtle, chilling irregularities. One page described a strange glow on the horizon, noting that several crew members had murmured about the ocean whispering. Another referenced minor compass errors and equipment malfunctions, yet no mechanical reason could explain them. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances, the kind that acknowledged they were no longer dealing with a typical maritime recovery. Among the crew, no personal effects were found to indicate departure. Tools remained mid-use in the workshop. Beds were unmade, blankets half-draped. A half-empty mug sat on the captain's desk. Every object suggested sudden absence, yet total preservation. The logbook reinforced the suspicion that the disappearance of Meridian was not merely a maritime accident. It was something the human mind could scarcely interpret. As officials documented the evidence, a junior officer discovered a peculiar page tucked between the final entries. It was blank except for a faint smudge resembling a fingerprint, oddly intact despite decades. It suggested someone had touched the page, leaving a trace of presence. The discovery sent a shiver through the team. Even after 90 years, it was as if the crew had never left. By late afternoon, the investigators gathered in a corner of the captain's quarters. The logbook lay open between them, a haunting record of a voyage suspended in time. One of them whispered, almost reflexively, "If the ship returned, where's the crew?" No answer could satisfy the question. And as the sun dipped below the harbor horizon, casting long shadows across the polished deck, one thought prevailed. Whatever had taken Meridian, and preserved it so perfectly, was not finished. The scratches beneath the hull, the echoes of voices, an impossible logbook hinted that the mystery was deepening. The investigation would not remain confined to paper or ledger. Something waited unseen beneath the surface. The hull of the Meridian had remained pristine at first glance, but divers assigned to examine the vessel in detail soon found marks that defied easy explanation. Deep, jagged scratches lined the lower planks, running in irregular streaks as if something or someone had fought to climb aboard. The grooves were human in scale, yet their depth and placement suggested immense force. Marine biologists were consulted, and they could find no natural explanation. No sea creature known to inhabit those waters left patterns like this. No coral growth, no barnacle formation, no erosion matched the damage. The scratches were deliberate, violent, yet oddly ordered, like the motions of a panicked hand clawing for salvation. Investigators documented every inch, photographing each groove under multiple angles and lighting. The deeper marks appeared beneath the waterline, as if someone had attempted to ascend from the ocean itself. One diver, Thomas Nguyen, reported the unsettling feeling that the scratches seemed to pulse beneath his touch, as though they carried memory, a trace of struggle embedded in the wood. He refused to speak further on it, citing only that it had felt alive. In the captain's quarters, analysts cross-referenced the scratches with the logbook. The final entry mentioned the fog, voices, and an approaching presence. The more they studied the hull, the more it seemed to confirm the impossible. The ship had not just disappeared. It had resisted something from the water, something unseen. One technician muttered that it was as if the crew had tried to climb back aboard after vanishing, yet left nothing behind. The thought unsettled the team more than any meteorological anomaly or temporal theory ever could. The scratches also bore clues in their pattern. Some were vertical, jagged, others shallow and horizontal, almost like someone had tested the water before committing fully. Analysts measured the depth and width meticulously, calculating the force required to produce such marks. None of the diver accounts or known physics could fully reconcile the evidence. It was, as one veteran investigator later wrote in his report, a scream frozen in wood. In the harbor office, retired officers were consulted for insight. One recounted an unsolved maritime incident from the 1950s where a vessel was recovered with unexplained claw-like marks on its hull. He paused when asked about it, suggesting that the Meridian might not be an isolated event, but part of a larger, inexplicable pattern. Researchers began compiling historical reports, linking strange disappearances across decades, all with subtle hints of markings, scratches, and vanished crews. The realization spread slowly. The Meridian was no longer just a mystery of 1933. It was a node in a chain of impossible maritime events. By evening, divers returned with preliminary scans revealing faint residue inside the scratches. Forensic teams began analyzing the samples, hoping to determine whether the marks were recent or ancient. Even as the chemical analysis commenced, one unsettling thought lingered among the investigators. Whatever had left those scratches might not have been human, or if human, had interacted with time in ways they could not yet comprehend. And as the night fog rolled over the harbor, washing the deck in silver light, every member of the team felt the same quiet apprehension. The scratches were not simply evidence of struggle. They were a warning. And the deeper the investigation probed, the closer they came to forces that might never be fully understood. Weeks after the Meridian was secured, a young investigative journalist named Lena Crawford gained access to archival records long thought irrelevant. Hidden within a maze of bureaucratic folders, she discovered Henry Dowka's private notes from 1933. Unlike the official Maritime report, Dowka's observations were raw, unfiltered, and unsettlingly precise. He had recorded every sighting, every anomaly along the ship's path, and most of all, the strange phenomena reported by other mariners in the days following the disappearance. Yet much of his work had been censored. Entire paragraphs were blacked out, numbers scratched through, letters erased with ink. The redactions were deliberate, suggesting a level of secrecy far beyond standard procedure. Even the simplest weather notes had been obscured, as if the authorities feared that revealing the full picture might make the world aware of what they had truly witnessed. Crawford's instincts told her that the truth lay not in what was written, but in what had been deliberately hidden. Among the surviving notes, she found accounts of unexplained lights on the horizon, mysterious fog banks that defied meteorology, and faint, whispering noises that emanated from the sea itself. One crew member, unnamed in the documents, reported seeing figures on the deck of the Meridian just before it vanished. Dowka's own annotations beside the entry were terse, cannot confirm. Witness credibility questionable, yet details match independent accounts. The more Crawford read, the more she realized the reports were not isolated. They were consistent, forming a pattern that the official files had ignored. A glossary of terms used in Dowka's notes included phrases like temporal distortion and anomalous drift, jargon that would have seemed fantastical in 1933, but now, given the ship's inexplicable return, appeared almost prophetic. One folder stood out, a small packet labeled page 47, sensitive. It had been removed from a main file, sealed in an envelope, and stamped classified. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with a faint, smudged fingerprint at the corner, smaller than a man's hand, but unmistakably human. The rest of the page was blank. Crawford examined it repeatedly, feeling a creeping unease. Who had handled it? When? And why had it been kept separate for so many decades? The redactions became more than bureaucratic obfuscation. They were a clue in themselves. Each omission pointed toward the same chilling conclusion. The disappearance of the Meridian had been observed, recorded, and then deliberately hidden. Someone had wanted the world to forget, to let the story vanish alongside the ship. Yet, The resurfacing of these files proved that history does not remain buried indefinitely. As night fell over the harbor, Crawford placed the documents back into her bag, realizing that the Meridian was far more than a lost ship. Its return had reopened old wounds and unsealed decades of secrets. And in the shadows of the redacted pages lay a single, unanswered question, one that would draw investigators toward the very heart of the mystery. The scratches in the hull, the impossible logbook, and now these forbidden files were threads, all converging. Somewhere, just beneath the surface of reason, the true story of the SS Meridian waited to be revealed. The day after Lena Crawford's discovery of the redacted files, experts gathered on the Meridian to examine the vessel and review all available evidence. The scratches, the logbook, and the fingerprint in Dowka's pages had already baffled investigators, but now the focus shifted to a phenomenon that few could explain. The fog. Maritime climatologists were called in, and preliminary analysis revealed an anomaly that bordered on impossible. Satellite records did not exist in 1933, of course, but historical accounts suggested a persistent, thick fog had been reported in nearby waters in the weeks preceding the Meridian's disappearance. Eyewitnesses had described it as unnatural, luminous in certain spots, moving against a prevailing wind. The fog, the team realized, might hold the key. It was not merely a weather pattern, but a variable that defied conventional measurement. Psychologists, physicists, and meteorologists debated whether the crew had entered a localized atmospheric anomaly, one that might have affected time perception, navigation, even cognitive function. The Meridian's logbook had referred to voices carried over the water, a horizon that bent, and instruments that refused calibration. Taken together, the observations pointed to a singular, terrifying possibility. The crew had encountered something that existed outside ordinary reality. Investigators began mapping reports of similar fog phenomena worldwide: Japan, Canada, Norway. Over the decades, isolated accounts told of vessels drifting into thick, glowing mists, only to vanish temporarily. Each description carried the same hallmarks: distorted time, optical illusions, eerie sounds, and sometimes the inexplicable disappearance of the crew. These were not folkloric tales, the scientists argued. They were consistent anomalies with physical manifestations. The team simulated maritime conditions in a computer model, combining historical wind patterns, ocean currents, and temperature inversions. The results suggested a strange loop. A vessel entering such a fog could drift out of its temporal plane, effectively frozen from the perspective of the outside world while subjective time slowed or stopped aboard. Instruments would fail. Compasses would spin. Radio signals might vanish into static. The theory, while speculative, accounted for many of the Meridian's impossibilities. But one problem remained unsolved. If time dilation had occurred, why had the ship returned after 90 years? Perfectly preserved and without its crew? No model could explain how the vessel could reintegrate into normal space without evidence of the human presence that had once occupied it. The logbook's ink, still fresh, the scratches in the hull, the half-finished meals, all suggested a temporal discontinuity that defied reason. In the quiet of the analysis room, investigators stared at the charts, at simulations, at photographs of the fog on the Meridian's deck. It was clear the anomaly was more than atmospheric. It was a portal, a threshold that humans were not meant to cross. The fog was not merely a natural obstacle. It was a boundary between what could be observed and what remained unknown. And as the sun dipped behind the harbor horizon, casting long, diffuse shadows over the ship, one thought crystallized in every mind present. The Meridian's return was not just a recovery, it was a message. Something had claimed the crew, yet spared the vessel. The fog had spoken across time, and the investigation was only beginning to decode its language. As investigators pieced together evidence from the logbook, hull scratches, and redacted files, a new lead emerged from an unexpected source. At a quiet assisted living home in coastal Maine, a 96-year-old man named Samuel Whitcomb claimed he had been aboard the Meridian the night it vanished. His voice was frail but steady, and the lines on his weathered face traced a lifetime of secrets. Few gave him initial credence. 90 years is a long time to remember any event, but something in his recollection immediately matched details from the captain's log. Whitcomb spoke slowly, haltingly, yet vividly. He described the fog that had rolled across the deck like a living wall, swallowing the horizon in silence. He recalled the strange stillness of the ocean, instruments spinning without reason, and the sensation that the ship had become untethered from time itself. According to his account, crew members had attempted to investigate the anomaly, some stepping into the fog as though drawn by an unseen hand. None returned. Only he had found a gap, a moment when the mist thinned enough to retreat into the ship. Investigators noted the eerie precision in his recollection. He mentioned the scratches on the hull, the half-drained mugs in the mess hall, and even the exact words of Captain Rain's final log entry. These were details Whitcomb could not have known from newspapers, archives, or rumor. Psychological assessment confirmed that he was not fabricating. His memory, though fragmented by age, had been preserved with extraordinary clarity. Yet his story was riddled with contradictions, as one would expect from someone recalling events nearly a century old. He spoke of seeing his fellow crew members alive, then disappearing mid-step. He recalled voices calling from the water, but insisted the ship had felt completely still at the same time. Investigators struggled to reconcile the testimony with scientific models. Some elements aligned perfectly with the fog theory. Others defied physics entirely. It was as if Whitcomb had witnessed two realities simultaneously, one within the fog, one outside it. Among the team, unease grew. Whitcomb described an odd, carved symbol on the deck, faint but unmistakable, that he claimed had appeared only after the fog lifted. For decades, it had remained invisible, obscured by time and neglect, yet now it matched scratches discovered by divers. This connection lent credibility to the possibility that Whitcomb's experience was not an isolated hallucination, but a fragment of a larger, inexplicable event. As the interview concluded, Whitcomb paused and looked directly at the investigators. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll see it too," he said, "if you know where to look. The Meridian, it waits. It remembers." Even after he was escorted back to his room, his words hung in the air like the residue of the fog itself. Investigators left the facility unsettled, carrying the chilling realization that they'd encountered a survivor of a phenomenon no one fully understood. And as the sun dipped toward the harbor, casting long shadows across the Meridian's deck, the team knew that the puzzle was far from complete. The scratches, the logbook, the fog, and now the survivor's tale, all threads pointing toward a truth that demanded to be uncovered. One question loomed larger than all others. If anyone had escaped the fog, why had the ship returned alone, and what had claimed the rest of the crew? Reconstructing the final moments aboard the SS Meridian was like piecing together a puzzle with missing fragments. Investigators combined data from the logbook, Whitcomb's testimony, the redacted files, and the whole scratches, yet the picture remained incomplete. Each piece seemed to contradict the others, but disturbing coherence began to emerge. The last hour of the Meridian had been unlike any ordinary passage at sea. According to Whitcomb, the fog had approached gradually, at first thin and almost ethereal, then thickening into a wall of gray that distorted the horizon. Instruments failed in sequence. The compass spun endlessly, the engine readouts fluctuated without cause, and radio signals disappeared. Crew members, usually disciplined and steady, grew uneasy. They whispered about voices carried over the mist, soft and distorted, as though coming from beneath the water. The logbook corroborated parts of this account. Captain Rains had recorded the fog's approach, noting the unexplainable bending of the horizon and minor anomalies in the ship's course. But the log also hinted at something more. One entry, short and fragmented, mentioned hands reaching from the deep, crew attempting to resist time slipping. Investigators speculated that the captain had perceived phenomena outside normal comprehension, yet his words were precise, lacking the panic that might be expected in such a moment. Simulations built from historical data suggested the Meridian had entered a localized temporal anomaly. For those aboard, minutes stretched or stalled unpredictably. Time outside continued normally, but within the fog, perception warped. The scratches on the hull suggested desperate attempts to climb or escape, consistent with Whitcomb's memory of crew members stepping into the mist and vanishing. It was a tableau of both struggle and suspended reality. The final moments, reconstructed through cross-referencing all evidence, revealed a grim sequence. Some crew attempted to leave the ship, drawn by unseen forces or trapped by the fog's pull. One or two nearly returned, leaving traces on the deck, but the majority disappeared completely, leaving only the empty vessel. Captain Rain's final entry, ending abruptly, hinted that he had observed the anomaly firsthand but could not intervene. Investigators felt the weight of it. Here was a man who had seen the impossible unfold, had recorded it with painstaking precision, and yet even he could not survive the anomaly. Wickham's account provided a singular exception, a crew member who had slipped through a narrow temporal gap. Yet even he had been unable to save the rest of the Meridian's crew. By the time the fog lifted, the ship itself had returned to normal space, appearing intact, unweathered, as if no century had passed. Everything the crew had left behind, the meals, tools, logbook, and scratches, served as frozen testimony. The last hour of the Meridian was not just a measured time. It was a collision between human endurance and forces beyond comprehension. Standing on the deck, investigators realized the truth they faced. The Meridian had survived, but its crew had not. And the questions left unanswered, the precise nature of the fog, the anomaly, the selective preservation, would drive the inquiry into a deeper, more unsettling reality. The story of the ship was far from over, and its secrets were only beginning to surface. The SS Meridian rested in Greywater Harbor, its hull gleaming under the morning sun, yet it carried a weight far greater than any material cargo. The ship had returned, unscathed and pristine, but absent were the crew who had vanished in 1933. The world stared in disbelief. Historians, journalists, and investigators crowded the dock, cameras flashing and questions fired relentlessly, but the most chilling reality remained. The Meridian had come back alone. Inside the vessel, every corner told a story of sudden absence. Mugs on tables, blankets half-folded, tools left mid-use, all spoke of lives interrupted, a frozen moment suspended in time. The logbook sat open, its final pages bearing the handwriting of Captain Rains and the notes of a young radio officer, Alan Brooke, neither of whom had returned. Investigators could not shake the sensation that the ship itself was a message, an artifact sent back from history, to confront the living with a truth too strange to dismiss. Forensic teams scoured the decks and cabins. Fingerprints were cataloged, dust samples analyzed, and the scratches in the hull re-examined. The logbook confirmed what time itself seemed to have hidden. The crew had entered the fog, some resisting, some pulled under an impossible influence, leaving only one survivor's account. Wickham's story had aligned with physical evidence, yet it provided no comfort. The hands that had steered, cooked, and maintained the ship were gone. There was no reunion, no resolution. Across the harbor, families of the lost crew gathered, decades of grief renewed in a single day. Children long grown, grandchildren too young to remember the original tragedy, all confronted the impossibility of the Meridian's return. Some wept openly, others simply stared, mouths agape, as if the ship's presence had suspended their capacity to process reality. Margaret Rains, now elderly, traced her fingers along the rail where her father had once walked. The warmth of memory collided with the cold clarity of absence. Scientists debated, journalists speculated, and authorities struggled to issue statements. No conventional explanation could reconcile the survival of the vessel with the disappearance of the crew. The fog, the temporal anomaly, the scratches, the logbook, Wickham's recollections, all pointed to the same disturbing conclusion. The ocean had claimed the crew in a manner beyond human comprehension, yet had preserved the ship as evidence of what had occurred. As night fell over the harbor, a strange quiet enveloped the Meridian. Its lamps glowed faintly, untouched by time, and the water lapped silently against the hull. Observers reported an uneasy sensation, as if the ship itself were aware, as if it carried a consciousness that had witnessed the century-long absence of its crew. The anomaly was no longer theoretical. It had left tangible proof. Investigators, historians, and witnesses alike understood one immutable truth. The Meridian's return had not closed the story. The crew's fate remained unresolved, the anomaly unexplained, and the questions unanswered. In a single, haunting gesture, the ship had crossed time and space only to confront the living with the stark reality of loss. And the final chapter of this mystery was still waiting to be written. The final chapter of the SS Meridian story did not come of fanfare. No grand unveiling, no triumphant resolution. Instead, it arrived quietly, in the form of a single observation. The ship had returned not as an anomaly of destruction, but as a witness. Every plank, every untouched mug, every open logbook spoke for those lost, offering a record of events that could not otherwise be told. Investigator, historian, and scientist gathered, scanning the vessel for one last clue, a key to the ultimate question. What had taken the crew, and why had the ship returned without them? Lena Crawford, now at the center of the investigation, reviewed all evidence once more. The fog's behavior, Whitcomb's testimony, the redacted files, and the temporal irregularities. Patterns emerged when examined collectively. The anomaly, she realized, was selective. It did not consume the vessel itself. It had claimed the crew because their human presence interacted with the temporal distortion differently. The ship, as if by design, was preserved as both proof and message, an object immune to the forces that had removed its inhabitants. Forensic examination revealed a startling consistency. The logbooks, ink, the scratches on the hull, and the fingerprints all indicated events frozen in a temporal loop. Chemical analysis of residues in the fog-exposed areas of the ship suggested a prolonged, anomalous exposure, one that could bend perception of time and space without leaving conventional evidence. Whitcomb's account, previously dismissed as improbable, now formed the linchpin of understanding. The anomaly had a structure, rules, and limitations. The fog was not random. It was a corridor through time, taking what was human and leaving what was inanimate, and the Meridian itself had acted as a temporal anchor. In quiet moments aboard the ship, investigators noted something almost imperceptible. A faint warmth on the deck, an echo of life preserved in wood and metal. It was subtle, a physical whisper of what had once been. The final revelation crystallized. The Meridian's return was not an end, but a record. The crew had survived in memory only, their presence encoded in the vessel itself. The anomaly had not destroyed them. It had suspended them, removed them from conventional reality, leaving the ship as a bridge between their existence and the world they had left behind. Families wept silently as the implications settled in. They could not reclaim their lost loved ones, but they could acknowledge their enduring presence in the Meridian, preserved against the ravages of time. The ship had become a monument, not to death, but to absence made tangible. As the sun set over Greywater Harbor, its light glinting off the untouched deck, Lena Crawford looked across the water. She understood, finally, that some mysteries were not meant to be solved fully, but be observed, honored, and remembered. The SS Meridian had returned to remind the living of the fragility of human existence and the vast, unknowable forces that govern the sea. And in that realization, the investigation reached its conclusion, not with answers, but with understanding. The crew was gone, yet their story remained, etched into wood, ink, and memory. The final revelation was not what had taken them, but what had endured in their absence, the silent, haunting witness that was the SS Meridian. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.